And I've got to say, Howard, Rodney, it would not surprise me in the slightest if pricing is still very, very strong and going to get stronger, because the problem is not getting solved today. There is a requirement for a lot more lithium units in the supply chain than the supply chain can currently handle. Arguably, if the capital doesn't start to flow upstream at the right pace, pricing is only going to get more extreme and assets are only going to get more expensive.
So Ken, you were just you're back in Perth. We met at PDAC last week, and prior to that, you were at the BMO conference with Patriot. But I understand Pilbara was at that conference, not only presenting to investors, but also there as a potential strategic investing prospectively in other companies. To your point, what do you think on price, and have you started to see investments at the right pace? And what's your view on where we are in the spodumene and lithium carbonate pricing market now that we've had a 30 to 40% retracement in the China spot price? Not exactly clear where we are on spodumene because the last BMX auction didn't happen because Pilbara did a tolling arrangement. So with that opening, I'll leave the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. I'll look utmost respect to the Pilbara team for obvious reasons. They're very, very capable people, and I reckon industry leading as it relates to dealing with and understanding the value in the spodumene in the market. So the fact that they've undertaken a tolling deal looks to me like a really good move. Why wouldn't you continue to explore all of the sales channels at your disposal to ensure that you're maximizing price, that you're finding the marginal buyer? And there's no doubt about it, they've got some leverage in the market because they have available capacity and flexibility as to where they place that product. So good on them, I say, Howard. I think all those moves are in the right direction. And as I said, a very capable team. Yeah, the prices come off, and of course, equity markets, they don't like that. But I think for every producer, there's so much more than a short-term game in play here. What I shared back in the latter part of 2021, and really even from the second half of 2020, I was really optimistic about the direction that spodumene was going to take, because we could see a significant build out in chemical capacity, but it was happening without any reference to spodumene supply. So it seemed to us that at some point in time in the cycle, there was going to be leverage in owning the rock, as our peer would say, Chris Ellison. So my view hasn't changed there. I think where there is margin in the supply chain, for the most part, you are going to see that flow upstream to the raw material suppliers, because that's the biggest and most difficult piece in the puzzle to deliver. And bear in mind, the backdrop that within which I'm sharing that feedback is to say I'm thinking about the medium term and the long term in the industry. I would still say there hasn't been enough capital deployed in raw material supply to ensure an even distribution of lithium units in the supply chain, neither in the short, medium, or the long term. So yeah, still very optimistic, Howard.
But you said mining's the hardest. Elon Musk is saying refining's the hardest, and that's where the margin is. So you are outwardly disagreeing with Elon Musk.
Yeah, I'd love to know who's advising Elon, because I couldn't disagree more, basically, with the position that he's taken. Refining capacity is not an issue globally. Sure, there's a concentration of refining capacity in China today, but I'm equally optimistic that that capacity is going to be built out elsewhere around the world. And bear in mind, to build chemical capacity, realistically, something like 18 months to 24 months is probably not a bad estimate for building some capacity. But a mine is measured virtually in decades as to the delivery of its capacity. And that mismatch cannot be solved shortly or in short order. So I feel like he's either a genius talking his own book because he wants us all to believe that there is excess raw material, or in fact, he's being poorly advised, because, yeah, I just cannot agree with that thesis.
I think the problem is, Ken, is in first principles, which is what Elon Musk thinks in, there is lithium everywhere, which no one's disputing. What we're seeing practically on the ground is, as you mentioned, I think 2022, there was less investment upstream than there was in 2021, if that's possible to believe. And everyone says it's everywhere, but I'm not going to fund it and I'm not going to participate in it. So Tesla's not funding it, and neither are others. They say, I don't want to be a miner, but it's everywhere and someone else is going to do it. And don't worry, it's everywhere and it's going to be presented downstream. So again, I think that's where the disconnect comes in, is that they think someone else will take care of it, and they don't permit anything when they do something, and they deal in first principles, solving powertrains and doing those other things. But mining, as you know, from the coal face, as it were, or from the lithium face, is much tougher.
Yeah, exactly. Lithium itself is not rare, but the confluence of events that make a sensible and timely development are. So the right location for the product, the right volume, the right quality within the right time frame, that's what's rare. And unfortunately not that well understood by the end users. And I've said it before, I think that the battery makers and to a certain extent the car makers haven't served themselves well. They haven't really understood the supply chain, pulled it apart, put it back together again, and worked out their part to play in ensuring that the product gets delivered at the right time. And unfortunately, that means that they're going to have to pay for it in kind to make it happen.
I think if we wind back the clock a little bit, a lot of the guys can seem to think, well, we'll just turn to the South Korean battery makers or whoever it is. And when EVs were 1 or 2% of your sales volume, it didn't really matter. They could source something. But I think they've been caught off guard, and now timelines, geopolitics, lots of different things, logistics, everything's come into play now, and suddenly it is a lot more difficult. And I think the truth is, consumer preference towards EVs has caught the world off guard. It's even caught us. I mean, we didn't think it was going to go at this rate. I mean, China's over 30% EV penetration.
Yeah, the consumer is genuinely switched on now, and it's a realistic proposition to consider the purchase of an EV. If you're a car maker, it's a pretty scary thought, because they don't really want your existing product, and you're not quite ready for the new product to be delivered. So it's a huge challenge for them.
The acceleration in consumer adoption is just much faster than you think, and we see that. So all the surprises have been on the demand side, positive surprises. All the negative surprises have been on the supply side. Western Australia has been a major source of spodumene supply units. There's all sorts of lithium types. There's brines in South America. There's these unconventional DLE brines, there's clay and sediment. You left Pilbara. We've talked about Western Australia being crocodile rock. We've noticed, using, again, pop culture references, Crocodile Dundee, a bunch of Aussies coming to North America. We were lucky enough to be associated with one that came to America, US, in Piedmont, in Tazo Arima, but a lot have followed him into Quebec and Ontario and other places in Canada. Canada has had a number of false starts. You say refining's easy, mining's hard, but you've had two companies in Quebec that have failed, trying to do both mining and refining in the past. A lot of that was cost related, given the competitive advantage Western Australia has to the market where all the buyers have been historically in China. That's changing, but why Canada, and is Canada poised to kind of replicate, I guess, for North America and prospectively Europe, what you have with Western Australia kind of going to China? And I know there's some other refineries being built, in Western Australia. Why leave familiar territory?
Yeah. No, look, it's a logical line of inquiry, Howard. I think one of the key differences in the first round of hard rock supply growth was that Western Australia had a ready market available in China. An enormous track record of resource delivery in Western Australia, serving kind of Asia's, largest importer of raw materials. And that was a well-trodden path. So if you're going to develop a spodumene mine, it's very, very natural for the West Australians to look to China. And in fact, in part, we were solving their problem because they were starting to build capacity, but without really having raw materials in place. So big tick there. In contrast, the first round of assets being developed in North America, I think, not to put too fine a point on it, smaller in scale, potentially more difficult to mine, and no natural chemical capacity other than the fact that you would ship it to China. So, the combination of those things meant that it was always going to be a harder start. This time around, we're seeing the rise of North America as a key market for battery raw materials. And now I think it's matched with a genuine intent, as you say, some of it motivated by Australian interests, to get in on the ground in North America, but in particular Quebec and Ontario, and give it a red hot crack from an exploration point of view. Whilst I don't pretend to be an expert in Canada or North America, I'm learning that it's a very useful jurisdiction. And actually, to be honest, it actually feels a lot like working in WA. Healthy rule of law. If you're doing good quality work, you're going to be able to make a path forward for a development project. Constructive relations with First Nations, and an environment both at a provincial and federal level to genuinely see these new supply chains emerge. So all those things represent an attractive proposition personally for me, but I suspect equally for many others who are now looking at these jurisdictions as being key exploration projects and of course, you'd hope, future mines.
What are the differences? The infrastructure, there's a lot in Quebec in aluminum and a few other mining industries, but it's not like from an infrastructure point of view and logistics, it's not exactly the same as the Pilbara.
No, that's true. But if you took out the scale that exists in say, iron ore mining in the Pilbara, and you put that aside, actually, the suite of commodities that are being mined start to look really similar to Australia, but in particular Western Australia. It's another one of the world's great mining jurisdictions. I think it's fair to say that, because there's a steeped history in various commodities, and then more recently, the battery raw materials, and a genuine intent from the community. That might be First Nations, it might be the provincial government, it might be the federal government, a genuine intent to create these new supply chains and take advantage of their mineral endowment for this new energy economy.
So Ken, if you were to compare Western Australia to Quebec or Canada, but Quebec specifically, are there any sort of pros and cons? There's obviously cheap power and that type of thing in Quebec versus permitting. Are there any sort of standouts that come to mind?
Yeah, I've noticed a much more active participation from government, and I think that's true at, as I said, both at a provincial level and a federal level. In Australia, state governments and federal governments are much more hands-off with the mining industry. There is no such thing, well, not really, such a thing as direct investment, either in the companies or even complementary infrastructure. Typically, they would try and leave it to the individual companies to solve their problems. Contrast in Quebec especially, I think government's quite active. Funds that are deliberately targeting investment to support mine development and infrastructure development for the mining industry, and now a particular interest in the new energy economy. So I see that as being quite a stark contrast. As to the approvals process, common thread is healthy rule of law, well managed, and if you're doing high quality work, my view today would be you are going to make progress in both jurisdictions. So Quebec and Western Australia, I think you would say are very similar in that regard. On the First Nations front, Yeah, I've been lucky enough to meet with the Cree, including some of the local family to our project at Corvette, and I've really enjoyed the engagement. Actually, much as I've enjoyed the engagement in Western Australia as well with traditional owners, I can see a lot of similarities, and in the end, I think what it comes down to is everybody wants to be treated with respect, and as long as you are living towards that aim, you can look forward to a mutually beneficial relationship. And that's an area where I see a similarity between the two jurisdictions. So today, yeah, I'm optimistic. And the last point I'd make is, and this is principally it relates to the weather. I hadn't appreciated just how much, water there is, I guess, in the northern sort of reaches of Canada, as a function of the glacial flow historically, and as the snow melts today, of course, there's lots of water around. That has been a barrier to a really fulsome exploration effort, and that's why a company like Patriot, can come along, tie up a new district, and find, what we believe is going to be a really significant project over the years to come. It seems pretty incredible in this day and age that you can go and poke a hole into a new district for lithium that previously wasn't really considered. But I guess I now, having been there, have a better understanding as to why that might happen. It's difficult terrain to get around. Every piece of exploration initially is going to be helicopter supported, so it's typically a bit more expensive in Australia. As much as you might be driving up and down sand dunes, at least you can drive. Whereas in Canada, you're going to be walking or you're going to be in a helicopter. So with that as a backdrop, you might say maybe we should be optimistic that there will be more discoveries. And I think that's a distinct possibility. And again, another reason to be hopeful that they are going to be really important mining jurisdictions for the North American supply chain.
Lithium's not rare. Everybody knows that. There's lithium in oil field brines and in salars everywhere, but Western Australia was largely perceived to be, is largely perceived to some degree to be picked over by a lot of Australians, and that's why they've come to Canada, which has, had less exploration done. And that's, again, the Crocodile Dundees. There's lots of companies on this Canada Rocks conference. There's a few new ones, but Patriot was new just a year ago. So within the context of, again, the 4 lithium types, there's sediment, there's lots of tons of sediment known, advancing projects for years. There's lots of tons of oil field brines. There's lots of tons, in Argentina and Bolivia, et cetera. There's this belief that, there's peak spodumene, I think someone talked about maybe in Western Australia, but spodumene has proven itself in the last few years to be the most scalable, quickest to production, reliable, secure supply chain, but also sustainable. Like, it's been given a knock that everyone, points out if you do the life cycle assessments that the dirtiest is, spodumene from Western Australia going into China. A lot of that is because the China grid is dirty. But what do you think about, there's been narrative shifts within the lithium industry. There was a big wave of interest in these DLE plays a couple of years ago, and Quebec, which was like the most hated jurisdiction for lithium based on the failures, is now essentially the hottest market, Quebec and Ontario, based on high grade discoveries, taking place. So how do you see, I guess, Canada's role from a spodumene point of view? We talk about the North American lithium triangle, in contrast to the South American lithium triangle, being from like North Carolina with, Albemarle, Kings Mountain, and Piedmont, to everything that's happening in Quebec, to everything that's happening in Ontario, as becoming perhaps the most reliable, scalable, secure, sustainable way to get lithium units into both North America and Europe. I mean, so what do you think about all of that?
Yeah, well, I'm fundamentally agreeing with just about everything you've said there, Howard. I think there's every prospect that the emerging North American supply chain becomes a low carbon footprint supply chain, even though people might, poo-poo the idea that hard rock can be a low carbon footprint supply chain. Those that seek to call out the hard rock supply chain as being a high carbon footprint solution are calling it too early, Howard, because there is so much more innovation to come that's going to fundamentally lower the carbon footprint in the supply chain. And I would simply point to the work that Pilbara Minerals is doing on the midstream product solution as being a really good example. The idea that you mine hard rock as a 5 to 6% concentrate, you ship it to China, and energy is expended, a carbon-intensive energy is expended to produce a battery-grade product is probably going to be old news in not too many years' time, because there will be much smarter supply chain solutions that materially lower the carbon footprint in the supply chain. So that's just one example. You've highlighted the Quebec, renewable energy solution in the form of the Quebec Hydro Scheme. That is an amazing piece of infrastructure, providing incredibly low-cost power and, of course, carbon-friendly solutions for future mining efforts. All of that is going to change the game. And I don't think that in 5 to 10 years' time, we're really going to be talking about hard rock being a high carbon footprint. In fact, I'd argue it's going to be ultra competitive.
We're going to be interviewing Blair Way for Patriot, but as you look at the landscape, I'm sure you were approached with a lot of opportunities while you're at Pilbara. And since you left Pilbara, if you could just talk about the region, that there's a lot of activity in the James Bay region in Quebec generally. So Winsome Resources, which we've been associated with, is starting to make an interesting discovery. There's another company on this panel, Idaho Champion, that's in between Patriot and Winsome, but you have Allchem, which owns 100% of their asset, Nemaska, a number of critical elements. Could you speak specifically to the kind of the James Bay exploration potential, right, and development potential? Because as of now, the only mines is Sayona Piedmont, coming on stream, and that's more south in the Val-d'Or region. So just talk about the exploration potential and then the development potential in James Bay.
Yeah, I think there's two sort of distinct opportunities. There's the one that says the James Bay area is relatively underexplored. And I've got to say, that's one of the things that surprised me about getting involved there. There is still a lot of ground to be picked over in a way that it's probably not possible in say, Western Australia. And that's because of that earlier commentary about it. It's relatively inaccessible. It's difficult to travel across that terrain. There's a lot of water around, and you need helicopter-supported exploration. So those things mean that there hasn't been enough geos crawling all over the ground. Therefore, there's opportunity. So that's part one. Part two is a bit more specific. It's that not only is there new discoveries, but they are new discoveries of scale, and they look completely different to the historical norm in North America. Really, really significant widths in spodumene dominant pegmatites. So they're not squibby little pegmatites. They're 100-meter wide things, which is important. Having started Pilgangoora, I can tell you don't really want to mine something that's small. You want to mine something that's big, because that's going to be the easiest thing to process. And then
surface.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you've got when you get into a little bit more detail, you've got, what does the mineralization look like? And that sort of takes you into a region that's just off the charts. The spodumene crystal development that I've seen well, I'm assuming the Corvette discovery, of course, but also potentially Winsome, is it's an incredible crystal structure. It's measured in in centimeters and meters, not in micrometers and millimeters. It's really really incredible to see, and tells you that you've got a very, very fertile system. So, as I said, in summary, huge exploration potential, and I think the Corvette discovery is as good an example as that as you're going to get. And then when you start to look at the minutiae of the discovery, you've got unbelievable widths of pegmatite, near surface, and incredibly well-developed spodumene crystal structure. So all those things make for a pleasure from an exploration and at a future development point of view.
In Matt Fernley's commentary, we were trying to figure out how to value hard rock companies, and Patriot has gone, it's in the exploration speculation phase. They haven't announced yet a resource, fantastic intercepts, beautiful. But how does one, if you're a viewer of this program and you see a stock chart like that, like I didn't buy it, I missed it. I had problems last year, but when I was first made aware of this, but then it doubled, and then it doubled again, and then it doubled again. So how do we think about looking at a pre-production, pre-resource unicorn, and relative to other, just how do you think about those things? You came in obviously in May or June of last year at a lower entry price once you identified, that there was something special there. But how should we think about valuation relative to peers that are many, many years advanced in the permitting process and heading toward production, like Frontier and Critical Elements, et cetera, are smaller market caps than Patriot?
Yeah. No, again, a really logical line of inquiry. I guess I'd go back to an earlier comment where I sort of said the confluence of events that creates not even just a lithium mine, but a special lithium mine is very rare. I think we might have talked about this once before, Howard. I referred to the concept of a mega mine in the hard rock lithium world.
Gigamine.
Something that Gigamine, there you go. So we need the gigamines to match the gigafactories, basically. And they are rare. So even in as good a jurisdiction as Western Australia, you've really only got 4 mines or 4 potential mines that match that, what I think of as being giga scale. So there's Wodgina, Pilgangoora, Greenbushes, of course, and maybe you throw in the same category Mount Holland, the SQM Wesfarmers development project. And then from there, you step down into the sort of lesser lights. So that's a jurisdiction that's been well picked over, typically been explored for lots of other things. Tin, tantalum, the pegmatites were known about for a long time, but really there was only 4 mass scale pegmatites. And that represents the challenge. And that's why those mines are the really valuable mines. You're into a scale that takes you into completely different territory that underwrites huge chemical developments for multi-decades. The confluence that delivers those events is very rare, and that's why those mines are very, very valuable.
Okay, great. Ken, thank you very much. Again, as always, a pleasure to meet you last week and talk to you, through the screen, and, excited to have you participate in our first ever conference.
My pleasure, Howard. Rodney, great to be with you guys, and keep up the good work.